Good morning again, everybody. If you could please take your seats. This is our last panel of the morning, where we're talking about the topic of who cares? How the world views the conflict with Russia and competition with China. We have heard a lot of perspectives, but now we wanted to turn it to other part of the world to get their perspectives. I will mention that in the program, María, Eugenia, Brizuela de Ávila, she had to drop out due to COVID. Where unfortunately we miss her, but we hope to welcome her next year. Now I'm going to turn it over to our able moderator, Amy Walter, who's the publisher and editor-in-chief at the Cook Political Report. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Neve. Very glad to be here for this pivot to the rest of the world and to get the perspective from three very smart, very able, very capable people who are sitting right next to me about the views of the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, China, the US, how it looks from the perspective of Southeast Asia and Africa. And I'd like to start off with framing this in sort of a 30,000-foot view and then get into some of the more specifics. We've been spending a lot of time at this conference talking about the US and the China relationship, and so much of it has been about the question of, are we in a new Cold War? Is that what we're looking at here with the US and China? And this battle for who has the sphere of influence, who is going to be the next superpower. But I'm wondering, and Jendayi, I'll start at the end with you, if you can give us the perspective you think that Africa and the rest of the world have about this US-Chinese relationship. Is this way we're looking at it from our perspective really stuck in sort of this Cold War mentality that's no longer appropriate?
Yes, thank you, Amy, and it's very good to be here with all of you. I think going from a 30,000-foot perspective and then specifically into African perspective, it's not very helpful, but it's quite understandable because anytime you're talking about strategic competition, it's quite easily to start looking at who's aligned with us and who's aligned against us. And sort of the Cold War use of proxies that were ideologically aligned becomes an easy trap to fall into. It was particularly the Cold War, I think, is different than today because this Cold War was especially about a military competition. Russia was not integrated economically with the rest of the world the way China is. And so the idea that African countries, for example, can choose between the United States and China is not realistic. And in fact, from their perspective, they do not want to be pawns on the chessboard of global powers. In fact, their view is, let us choose who we want to partner with. Our decision to partner, for instance, with China on the Belt and Road Initiative does not mean that we don't want to partner with the United States on infrastructure development, on investment, on democracy issues, on telecommunications issues, on security issues. There's this feeling of which we don't have to, because you're competing with China, it doesn't mean that that necessarily has to translate to us competing because truthfully, we're not really part of this big power game. Now, having said that, let me say something more. Whereas the competition, the Cold War was very different because Russia wasn't integrated globally the way China is. There is indeed a true struggle over the rules of the international system. And I think that's where China holds quite a lot of currency with African countries because when the Bretton Woods institutions and this international rule-based system was set up, we talk about a liberal international order, but in fact, it's a Western liberal international order. And we can ignore it by calling it a liberal international order. But when it was established, African countries were colonies. They did not have a major role in setting up these new institutions. And China uses that point like a battering ram They see the continent and the global South as the force to actually change these rules. And so I think that in that sense, there is indeed a true competition, and African countries don't need to choose between the West and the East or China. They don't even need to assert non-alignment. What they need to assert is solidarity, African solidarity, to move their interests, which is to get greater power in global governance.
Ambassador Mirpuri, I would like you to weigh in on this really excellent point here, that it doesn't need to be an either or when thinking about China and the U.S. The way that we think about China and the U.S. and its impact in the rest of the world, but more of a both and. So talk about that in reference to Southeast Asia and the way that you're seeing that.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here to sort of offer that perspective. Southeast Asia is in the heart of this competitive dynamic between China and the United States. China is a geographical fact in the region. It's an economic fact. It's been there for generations. It's risen, it's come down, it's risen again, but the region has had to learn to live with China. The United States has been, in many ways, the stabilizing force in the region. And we don't see the United States as an outsider. We see them as a resident power in the region as well. So the both of them dealing with a region of Southeast Asia, 600 million people, is really where that competition is taking place, day by day, week by week, month by month. We are unfortunately, and this few days in this conference here highlights that, but we feel it in Southeast Asia very much, in a divided world. Much as we would have preferred much more cooperation and coordination between the US, China, and other great powers, and we do have other great powers in the region, India, Japan, we are looking at a very divided world. And you know, some of the geopolitical developments that have taken place, particularly this year, but also before that, have added to that division. One, obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has challenged all international rules, which even if African countries may not necessarily feel they were designed at the time that they were in space to do it, we all live and survive by that. Without the UN Charter, without the concepts of sovereignty, territorial integrity, small states like Singapore will always be looking over our shoulders. So that's one development that's really concerned the whole region. The other is obviously US-China relations, that uncertainty in that relationship. Where will this end up? And I think these are the concerns that we feel, even as we have the competition, we have the trading relationships with both the US and China, we have security relationships around the region, so we're sort of operating in this space.
And I want to turn now to you, Ambassador Kimani, to talk a little bit more about China's investment in Africa, Belt and Road Initiative, the ways in which you, from your perspective from Kenya, are thinking about this, and the ways in which you can help those of us in the US understand that. And again, getting at this, the heart of this, should we see this as a threat, the US see this as a threat, an opportunity? Put that into context for us.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's wonderful being back in Aspen. It's a simple question to answer, but that makes it hard. One is, of course, how the United States thinks about China's investments in Africa. Is it a threat or an opportunity? I would answer that from my perspective, I don't care which of the two, as long as it leads to more investment from the United States into Africa.
Right.
And it minimizes the threat to African security. So whichever of the two you pick, depending on the pain points and the gain points that you determine, are fine. There's been a question, each time Africa has been talked about in major forums to do, when China is being discussed, we're discussed as a backdrop, as a sort of passive actor in a competition between these two superpowers. But of course, that's never quite true. No picture is ever quite that simple. We appreciate Chinese investment. We appreciate China's ability to give us options in terms of borrowing. A small example, one of our ministers went to Beijing for a meeting and saw one of the flyover roads. And we had a terrible traffic problem from the airport to the city center. And so he expressed admiration for this road, and then a few months later came a discussion and then a proposal for a public-private partnership to build a road from the airport into the city center. And that was up in just a couple of years, it was done. Around the same time, our head of state went to a major Western European capital, had fantastic conversation with the head of state there, and they agreed that there was going to be a major infrastructure project. 7 years later, it's nowhere to be seen. We have heard many pledges given at the G7 and different forums, from Building Back Better to the latest one on the $600 billion infrastructure investment fund. The question is this going to get to the ground, and is it going to ultimately count? For us, we want investment from all actors, as long as it is good investment into our economy.
But is your point that you can get it a lot easier and quicker from the Chinese than you can from either the US or other Western powers? So the benefit to you will be China first.
Well, just a bit of history is no country that I know of has achieved economic escape velocity from poverty to wealth without selling to Americans. And that includes China as well. And so the American market and American investment can serve when it happens, and happens with ambition, as I think Singapore is an example of that. Not only what Singapore did, but also the extent to which there was willingness to invest in Singapore. So American investment is extremely attractive, and I'll explain just very briefly why. Survey after survey show that Africans want freedom and democracy. But at the end of the day, once people have that freedom and democracy, they tend to be quite systems agnostic. They start to ask, okay, what is it good for? What does this democracy give me? And one of the special characteristics of American investment would be investment that enables democracy to deliver to African people, to deliver jobs and to deliver prosperity. And how does that look? That looks like some of the supply chain issues that were being discussed yesterday, the geographical distribution of supply chains. Why can't some of that be in Africa? Why must it only be in Asia or Europe? Right? Some of that is about connectivity. At the end of the day, a large amount of the risk premium that's stopping Americans from investing in Africa is a perception, is because of very poor data. We need to free that data, and freeing that data itself allows freedom to work on that data and to have an economic result. So yes, we want Chinese investment and we welcome it, and investment from Singapore and elsewhere. But the missing piece of the puzzle is dynamic American investment. And I think if it happens, it will make a great difference to Africa.
Jendayi, I'd love you to weigh in on this as somebody who comes into this with the perspective working at the State Department, working within the US government, responding to this and the idea of America. I like your point that you made, Ambassador, about democracy's ability to deliver.
Yeah, I have a perspective even more deeply now from the private sector. I've been out of government for 20 years.
Right.
But from, let me just say from the government perspective, Ambassador Kimani is exactly right that, you know, particularly of late, we're announcing all these initiatives, Build Back Better World, Global Partnership for Infrastructure Investment, but it doesn't seem that there has been significant planning interagency for what actually is to be accomplished. It's just a number that's put on a title with some, you know, good phraseology. We're going to invest in digital. We're going to invest in infrastructure. We're going to invest in, you know, climate. But the actual work to say, these are our targets, this is the lead agency that's gonna make sure this happens, it's not there. And so an initiative that's not well designed before you announce it is more likely just gonna be an initiative on paper and in rhetoric and in speeches. So that's from the government perspective. But from the private sector perspective, let me say that Ambassador Kimani knows I love that road, right? That overpass road. It gets me from my house in Nairobi, which used to take maybe an hour or so, in 15 minutes to the airport. But every time I take that road, which luckily is a toll roll, I wonder how much did the Kenyan people actually mortgage their future for this road, right? Because yes, it was built and it was built fast, but how much transparency was there? To what degree did Kenyan contractors really get to bid on that? It was a proposal from China. How much corruption went into that? How much kickbacks happened with that road? And that's true of the infrastructure story across Africa. Now, as a person who's always in Africa, I love the infrastructure. Let me be clear. The roads are needed, the energy's needed, there's no way to develop without it. But the terms are often corrupting, is the way I would put it, and certainly non-transparent. Not always. There's also a lot to be said about how we go about it, which it doesn't happen, right? Because we have, competitive bidding, and we have environmental studies and feasibility studies and this, that, and the other, and next thing you know, by the time it's all done, nothing has actually happened. So I think we're in between those two things. What I would say is that the U.S. government, and I heard this repeated in different ways all yesterday, which is the U.S. government has to help create an enabling environment for our private sector to get engaged in Africa. It's not about big initiative announcements, but how do you create investment tax system incentives for investment? How can you actually allow American companies to work in Africa, right? To become competitive with Chinese, government companies, right? Which is basically what most of them are. That, the most important thing is to unleash America private sector. And as Ambassador Kimani said, part of that is also changing our mindset. It's changing our understanding of risk. It's looking at long term. It's understanding the demographic changes that are happening globally, that 35 or 60% of the Africa's population is under 35. So that is the market of the future. It's 1.3 billion people today. It's a fragmented market. So, we say 1.3 like, woo, it's so big. It's very fragmented. It's very hard for American business to operate there. But Africa is making strides, and if America could have a future-focused Africa policy that understands it's driven by our self-interest and understanding that market and where global dynamism is going to come because of demographic issues, then we can have a policy that allows for the dynamism of American investment on the continent.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just take up that point about the critique of Chinese investment. And it's a point that I've heard many times. And, we could debate it all day. But at the end of the day, we need roads, we need fertilizer plants, we need energy, right? We need jobs. And if the United States and its companies are not there, we're going to get them from where we can get them, because it's about survival, it's about life, it's about prospering, it's about maintaining your democracy and holding on to it. I actually believe that the competitive spirit, because in the announcement for this session, it says competition with China, U.S. competition with China, and U.S. conflict with Russia. And I just want to remember, I agree with Jendayi, this is not the Cold War. It doesn't have the same characteristics. But during the Cold War, the United States used its market and investments as part of a package of appealing to countries on, quote unquote, its side. And there was an attraction factor, and the attraction factor said, if you're friends with the United States, you have a good chance of getting rich. Now, if you're going to have the same competitive feeling about China, I hope you conclude the same thing. Because we are very US facing, but at the same time, we have very good relations with China. We can question the nature of the investment by investment. I question that Chinese investment is corrupting. Maybe this company here is corrupting, that one isn't. But I think there's a unique opportunity here. And it might meet some of the strategic goals I've heard being said here over the last day. One is many of us were surprised by the geopolitical impact of food and fertilizer. Yeah. At least I was. Yeah. And Africa is suffering a great deal from the rise in fertilizer prices and food prices. Now, one of the ways that your strategic aims can be met while meeting our interests is to ensure that Africans are able to produce fertilizers and food in the largest arable area left on Earth independently. Doing that allows us to have cheaper food prices. Having cheaper food prices allows us to have a quieter street. A quieter street allows us to sustain our democracies longer and better. And on your side, you get to meet some other strategic aims of your own. I think there are a lot of marriages of interest as opposed to marriages of charity or marriages of, the softer stuff, but hard interests that Africa and the United States can sit across a table and agree on. And I would love to be part of that conversation. Maybe next year's ASPEN Security Forum can engage on this more.
You have the willing listeners right over here. You did a great job at pitching that. I want to shift us back to Southeast Asia for a minute. And Ambassador, the Vice President came to Singapore last year around this time, I think, and the media coverage, at least at the US, was, okay, this is the Biden administration trying to show that we're going to truly pivot to Asia, we're re-engaging with Asia. And I'm wondering if that is how Singapore perceived that, and if the United States is perceived as being disengaged from that region, whether because of previous administration or whether this is something that has been more ongoing, more than just a 4 or 8 year cycle.
To add on to my colleagues' sort of comments about the economic structure, and that's very important in Southeast Asia. The US has always played an important role in Southeast Asia. Singapore has a free trade agreement with the United States, more than 20 years old. It's opened up the Singapore markets, it's brought US investments to Singapore. It has meant that we've had to improve our rule of law, IP protection, which make us an attractive choice. We also have investments from China and other countries in the world. So the US has never actually left the region since the Second World War. It's emphasized over the past few years regional security. So they come around the region, freedom of navigation operations, that's an important part of the conversation for individual Southeast Asian countries and Indo-Pacific countries as well. But where I think it became very important was the economic engagement, creating frameworks that helped to bring US investments in. We were all partners in something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Took that for 6 to 8 years. The previous administration withdrew from it, but both parties were opposed to that because it actually created opportunities for market access for Asia-Pacific countries to enter the US. I mean, everyone wants to sell to the US. Having stepped away from that, it actually left a vacant space in the region. Whether you're pivoting or not, if you're not economically engaged, you are losing that opportunity. The current administration, to their credit, has just embarked on something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's not up to the standard of the TPP, which is now called the CPTPP. And as the Chinese ambassador told us yesterday, China wants to join the CPTPP while the US is absent. So we have this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It is focused on trade, it is focused on the supply chains, focused on the green economy. They've added in corruption and tax issues as well. They've tried to put everything together. And I think the challenge is, and that's really to your, I think what's underlying your comment, Amy, as we swing from administration to administration, you kind of get a little bit of whiplash in the region. Are we TPP? Are we out of TPP? Am I pursuing bilateral deals because that's where the focus is? Am I going back to something called IPEF? I credit this administration for having some strategic direction of what they want for the Indo-Pacific. They've set up things like the Quad, the AUKUS, now IPEF, various supply chain conversations. But I think the question that is being asked, what happens in 2024? Do we swing back again? And I think that's really the challenge the region faces.
Yep. And how many more P's can you put on into an acronym? And I want to address the domestic political piece in a minute, but before I do that, I do want to make sure that we touch upon Russia. And Ambassador Kimani, you had a speech at the UN that went a little bit viral about, this was in February, and making the case that what Russia was doing was similar to what we saw, or at least giving a perspective that was similar to Europeans and the colonization in Africa. So I'm wondering if you can help, for those who haven't seen this speech, to give us your perspective on that and tell us a little bit about that. And also, I would like for you and Jendayi as well to comment on why so many other African countries did not weigh in against the invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
Thank you. Kenya got its independence on the 12th of December 1963, and 4 days later we joined the UN. And that, at the time that we did that, we joined because we thought that multilateralism allows you to be more secure. It allows great powers, or it makes great powers not seek to dominate you in the ways that we've seen that had happened to make us into colonies in the first place. So to us, multilateralism and its underpinnings of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence are the basic foundations that must be maintained. And we have said this many times as Kenya. In February, there was an initial meeting that the US sought in the Security Council, which we're a member of, to discuss the issue of the potential invasion of Ukraine. The Russians called for a procedural vote on that meeting, and Kenya abstained. And this did not please a lot of our friends in Washington, because they felt that we were not being helpful. But we explained that there was still time for diplomacy. But then it turned out that the diplomacy failed. And so when these two breakaway regions were recognized, we then asserted our belief in territorial integrity and sovereignty, which had been breached by the Russian Federation. Now, the part of my statement that I made on that day on behalf of Kenya that receives the most attention, of course, is this comparison with the situation in Ukraine. But if you have the time to listen to the 4.5 minutes, you will see that I also referred to other breaches of the UN Charter, and not by Russia, but by other permanent members of the Security Council. This one was forgotten. The point here is that we need consistency. Multilateralism is never comfortable, especially for great powers. Why are you being restrained by these 192 other countries, some of them that are so small with such tiny populations? But we thought we had to assert that value. And I think the response to it was fantastic. As far as how African countries reacted, especially in the General Assembly, approximately half the countries voted to condemn the invasion of Ukraine, another half broadly abstained. And as the votes have increased to condemn Russia, the amount of African support for those votes has reduced. So by the time there was a proposal to vote to eject Russia from the Human Rights Council, the African vote for that was very, very low. And that comes to the point of the who cares part. We care desperately about the European security order. There's no region on earth that is more destructive and dangerous when it comes to war than Europe. European wars can destroy our economies. They can lead to great suffering for our people. So the creation of a secure and stable European security order is completely key to Africans, and I would even imagine to Singaporeans. And so what Africans and my colleagues in New York and elsewhere are seeing is, rather than seeing the eventual emergence of a secure European order, they're seeing its disintegration and its possible escalation. And for that reason, the next thing they think is not lack of sympathy for Ukraine, but is to understand the consequences of the last time Europe went to war with itself to our people. And when you think about it, you then take a more, I don't want to call it a more neutral stance, but a more careful stance, because you don't know where it's headed.
Well, and are the lingering effects now of this war, as you pointed out, food security, scarcity, having an impact on the way in which African, not the leaders, but people are seeing this conflict? Are you sensing that, a change in the way that that is being perceived?
Well, I'll say Jendayi, when she was Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, did a fair bit of mediating of conflicts. But I highly doubt there's any region on earth that understands mediation between conflicting parties as much as Africa. We do it all the time. And we do it because of the way our states operate and the pressures on our state. And when we look at the situation now in Ukraine, I've heard very passionate voices here at Aspen saying that there will be peace when one of the parties is totally crushed. And that creates a great concern, because that view, when you think about its impact economically, when you think about its impact to our people in terms of their food security, you realize that it could well mean the collapse of several African economies and great political instability. So it's very important, I think, for the great thinkers and strategists who are here at Aspen to understand that Africa is not opposed to the principles that we stood up for, but we are also profoundly conscious of the danger that we're in. And we would greatly appreciate those strategists and policymakers to be extremely sensitive about those unintended effects.
Ambassador Mirpuri, I want to pivot to the thing that we like to talk about when we're back in DC, which is US politics and the impact that our, shall we say, less than stable politics have had on the rest of the world. And I want you to give us your perspective on what people in this room, what policymakers, what US politicians need to appreciate about how our politics is being perceived around the rest of the world, and certainly from your perspective, and for the rest of the panel to weigh in on that as well. And then I'm going to open it up for the last couple of minutes here for some questions.
I don't think there's anything that I can say that the audience here doesn't already know. I've been in Washington for 10 years, and the focus is always on the next election. And the focus is on who's going to lose the next election rather than win the next election. So we all know the outcome of the midterms already, because the press has told us this at the start of 2021. We probably know the outcome to it, and Washington drives by this political agenda. And countries have to learn to live with that. Having worked with 3 administrations as they swing, we operate within the framework of saying, how long will this idea, how long will this concept and proposal be ready? How quickly can I get it done to get it resolved? Through each administration, Singapore has been very successful in having achievements. We have the long-term economic agreements. We have long-term security agreements. We're buying all sorts of equipment from the US. We have regular visitors. But really, as an ambassador sitting over there, you are watching to see how much time do I have to get anything done before they get so concerned about domestic politics.
Okay, but is it more than just policy and domestic politics going back and forth from one administration to the next, and certain policies that were popular here aren't popular over there? But looking at something like January 6th, looking at the level of anger and the lack of faith that many Americans have in the political system, what does that say to the rest of the world? What are we saying to the rest of the world in the way that we're operating right now?
America has the luxury to make mistakes. Most other countries do not. As my Kenyan colleague says, if we don't get it right in our countries today, we may not survive beyond a certain period. Kenya got independence in 63, Singapore got independence in 65. The US, you can afford to make these mistakes. I think on the democracy question, because you have framed the Russian invasion of Ukraine as democracy versus autocracy, then people start questioning what democracy are you trying to promote? And who are you putting in the autocratic camp just because you did not vote for the UN resolution? Are you basically an autocratic country? So I would prefer the framing that the ambassador has. Let's protect the UN Charter. Let's protect territorial integrity. That's really the important part. While the US goes through its processes of political change, which do take a long time. We're a 250-year-old country. And you can deal with these things, but most of us don't have that luxury. So we will have to decide on our immediate interests as things come up.
So Jendayi, as going into African countries, as you do often, going around the rest of the world, what are you hearing from folks around the world, folks in Africa, about what America stands for right now, what we look like right now?
Yeah, I think first, it's important to say that there's a tremendous reservoir of goodwill towards the United States in Africa. If you look at opinion polls done, Africa always says that it holds up, America. If America versus China versus Russia, America always is more favorable to the African population. Now that percentage is going down and down and down over the years. So I think that it's important there, and part of that is not because of the US government alone, and it's not because of our domestic politics, it's because our people are in Africa. Our civil society is in Africa. We're engaged, our religious communities, our faith communities are in Africa working. And so people have an understanding, and also our ideals are some that, for freedom and self-determination that people hold on to. They love those ideals, particularly in Africa where they had to fight for their independence. But that said, what I do hear persistently is they don't want to be lectured by the United States, right? Particularly African governments and African leaders. They're just fed up with the lecture.
A lecture about you should be better at democracy?
The lecture about everything. The lecture about, democracy, you should accept the rule of law, you should accept the outcome of an election, right? That's a favorite demarche of every American diplomat, right? You should, reach out to your opponents, don't be cronies, don't have a cult of the personality. Those are the lectures that, African leaders get. The lectures about, you should have an inclusive society, don't allow these ethnic divisions to happen. You should be inclusive in terms of, LGBTQ issues, and we're gonna sanction you if, some part of your population is opposed to this and you're in parliament trying to fight this. But yet, everyone gets CNN over there. So they know what's happening here. The very same things that they're struggling with as leaders in their parliaments, with their societies, which are divided, are the things that we're struggling with, but yet we go there and act as if it's so easy to actually create and keep a democracy moving forward. Right,
very,
and so
very
I
good
think
points.
they don't want the lecture.
Very good points. Do you want to weigh in? Yes.
Yeah, I've received my share of lectures, And you know, they always strike you because as a person's lecturing you, you're thinking of the headlines you read in the Washington Post, and sometimes it jars. But if you would accept a lecture back, I think great American foreign policy has more times than not been based on bipartisanship. And that bipartisanship is what allows for continuity and reliability of the United States as a partner. So the more you crash bipartisan accord, the more there's a whiplash effect on the rest of us, because you agree with one administration to do something, then the next administration comes and pushes in a different direction. So bipartisan accord is critical. But secondly, and this one I wouldn't fault so much the United States, but I could fault a few part of Western Europe, which is that, you know, when you lecture Africans about democratization and the fight for democracy, it's fine if you're sharing experiences. But I like to observe that the majority of stable Western European democracies were built before anyone who's alive today had been born. So most people in the West, their understanding of democracy is highly academic because they studied in college. They didn't build the democracy. They just were born into it. And that's an important difference to somebody who's building it now. Now, America has constantly renewed its democracy, whether it's a civil rights movement or other parts of it. So I think some of the present issues that you asked about, January 6th, et cetera, I think may remind our American friends just how precious institutions are and how fragile they can be, more fragile than you thought. And I think rather than it being a bad thing in terms of America's relations, it can create a greater sense of understanding, us understanding better the United States, and the United States understanding the man and the woman in the ring who are trying to build a democracy and the difficulties and limits that one has on human action when you're in those situations.
That's a perfect ender. Thank you so much for that perspective. I'm sorry we didn't get to questions. Our time has run short, and I know everybody probably would like to eat some lunch, but can you please give another round of applause for our fantastic panel?
Thanks so much, Amy and panel. Just so you know, for lunch it's being served in the Google Cloud Pavilion and also in the Davis Commons, which is also beautiful and outdoors. If you want to wander a bit further, there's a hot meal in there. And for the rising leaders, we can meet outside the door to walk over to our lunch. Thank you. We look forward to seeing you at 1:45.